The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow. Important things shouldn't arrive on Tuesdays. Tuesdays were for grocery lists and laundry cycles and the quiet hum of a life lived mostly alone. But the envelope sat in her mailbox between a water bill and a furniture catalog, cream-colored and heavy, the kind of paper that belonged to law offices and old promises. Miriam Alder set it on her kitchen counter and made tea first. She was 64 years old. She had learned, over time, that urgency was rarely as urgent as it pretended to be. The tea was chamomile. The kitchen was small. The apartment in Dayton, Ohio had been hers for 11 years, since the divorce, and she had never managed to make it feel like home. Not fully. There were still walls she hadn't hung anything on, corners that stayed bare, as though some part of her was always expecting to leave. She opened the letter with a butter knife. It was from an attorney in Harlan County, Kentucky, a place she hadn't visited in over 30 years. The letter informed her, in careful legal language, that her aunt, Colleen Alder, age 89, had passed away. And that Miriam was the sole heir to a property described as a residential lodging structure and surrounding acreage, located at 412 Bowen Creek Road. Miriam read the phrase 3 times. A residential lodging structure. She knew exactly what it was. She hadn't thought about it in decades, but the image rose immediately, the guest house. Her grandmother's guest house, tucked into the fold of a hill where the creek bent. The wooden sign out front that read, Alder Rest, though no one had rested there in Miriam's living memory. She set the letter down and looked out the window at the parking lot below. A woman was loading groceries into a sedan. A crow sat on a power line. She thought about calling someone, but there was no one obvious to call. Miriam drove to Kentucky on a Friday, 5 days after the letter. She told herself she was going to assess the property, sign whatever needed signing, and likely sell it. That was the practical thing. She had a modest pension from 26 years of nursing. She had savings that would stretch if she was careful. A crumbling guest house in a county she barely remembered was not part of any plan she had made. The drive took just under 4 hours. She took Route 23, south through the hills, watching the landscape change from flat suburban grid to something older and folded, the mountains pressing close like shoulders leaning in. The trees were just beginning to turn, early October, and the maples along the road burned in patches of orange and rust. She hadn't been back to Harlan County since she was 31. That was the last time, the funeral for her grandmother, Eloise Alder. She remembered the small church, the singing, the way the mountains seemed to hold the sound. She remembered standing at the graveside and feeling like she was burying a country, not just a person. After that, there had been no reason to return. Her father, Gerald, had left Kentucky long before Miriam was born, moving north to Ohio with his wife and his ambitions and his silence about where he came from. He spoke about his family the way people speak about weather in another state, distantly, without investment. When Miriam asked about the guest house, about Bowen Creek, about his sister Colleen who stayed behind, he would change the subject with a gentleness that felt like a locked door. Gerald died in 2006. Heart attack, quick and clean. Miriam's mother had died 3 years before that, from cancer that was neither quick nor clean. And so the family line had thinned to almost nothing, just Miriam, divorced, childless, and now Colleen, who had apparently lived alone in that hollow for decades without anyone checking in. Miriam felt guilt about that. Not the sharp kind, but the dull, permanent kind, like a stone in a shoe you've stopped noticing but never removed. She arrived in Harlan in the late afternoon. The town was smaller than she remembered, though she wasn't sure if it had shrunk or if her memory had inflated it. She met the attorney, a young man named Boggs, in a storefront office on Main Street. He was polite and efficient. He gave her the keys, 2 of them, brass, heavy, and a folder of documents. He told her the property taxes were current, that Colleen had paid them faithfully every year, that the house was livable but in need of repair. Did she run it as a guest house? Miriam asked. No ma'am, Boggs said. Not in my lifetime. I believe it closed sometime in the 70s. She just lived there. Kept to herself mostly. Miriam signed where he pointed. She took the keys. She drove the winding road to Bowen Creek with the windows down, smelling wood smoke and damp earth, and she felt something she hadn't expected, a pull. Not nostalgia exactly, but something older, like a root finding water. The guest house stood in a clearing where the creek made a slow curve westward. It was 2 stories, white clapboard gone gray, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The sign, Alder Rest, was still there, though the paint had faded to ghosts of letters, barely readable. The roof sagged slightly on the left side. A dogwood tree, enormous and ancient, grew so close to the porch that its branches rested against the railing like a hand on a shoulder. Miriam sat in her car for a long time before getting out. The inside smelled like old wood and lavender. Colleen had been meticulous in her way, the floors were swept, the kitchen clean, the furniture old but arranged with intention. There were 6 guest rooms on the 2nd floor, each one small, each one with a single bed, a dresser, and a window facing the hills. The beds were made. All of them. Fresh linens, pulled tight, as though someone might arrive at any moment. That detail unsettled Miriam more than the decay outside. Who makes 6 beds in a house no one visits? She chose the room at the end of the hall, the one that faced east. She set her suitcase on the bed and opened the window. The sound of the creek came in, steady and unhurried, and the cool air carried the smell of wet leaves. She stood there and breathed. In the days that followed, Miriam moved through the house slowly, room by room, the way you read a book you're not sure you want to finish. The parlor had a stone fireplace and shelves lined with old books, Bibles, almanacs, a few novels, their spines cracked and soft. The kitchen had an iron stove that still worked and a porcelain sink with a crack running through it like a river on a map. The dining room had a long oak table, 12 chairs, and a chandelier made of deer antlers that Miriam remembered from childhood, though she'd been too small then to see it from anything but below. Looking up at its strange and beautiful architecture. She found Colleen's personal things in the back bedroom downstairs, the one room that felt lived in. A rocking chair by the window. A radio. A Bible with passages underlined in pencil. A closet of simple dresses, all similar, all clean. On the nightstand, a photograph in a wooden frame, Colleen and Eloise, standing on the porch. Colleen looked young, maybe 30. Eloise looked old, the way Miriam always remembered her, white hair, sharp eyes, hands that seemed made for holding things together. Miriam picked up the photograph and studied it. She could see herself in both women. The jawline from Colleen. The brow from Eloise. But there was something else in the photograph, something in the way they stood together, close, but not relaxed. As if they were guarding the space between them. She put the photograph back and went outside to watch the light leave the hills. On her 4th day, Miriam found the ledger. She was cleaning out the parlor, sorting books into piles, keep, donate, discard, when it fell from behind a row of almanacs on the top shelf. It was a large book, leather-bound, the pages thick and yellowed. On the cover, in her grandmother's handwriting, it said simply, Guest Register, Alder Rest. Miriam carried it to the dining table and opened it. The entries began in 1952. Each page recorded a guest's name, date of arrival, date of departure, and a column labeled Notes. The early entries were sparse and businesslike, traveling salesman, a schoolteacher from Virginia. A family passing through on their way to Tennessee. The notes were brief, paid in full. Left early, road conditions. Pleasant company. But as Miriam turned the pages, moving through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the entries changed. The notes grew longer. More personal. Arrived in distress. Stayed 3 nights. Left calmer. Young woman, no luggage. Given clothes from the closet. Man with burns on his hands. Did not ask questions. And then, a pattern emerged that Miriam almost missed because she was reading too quickly. She went back and read again, more carefully this time. There were guests who had no last names. Only first names, or sometimes initials. Their stays were longer, weeks, sometimes months. And in the notes column, instead of the usual observations, there were codes. A small S in pencil. A tiny cross. A number that didn't correspond to any room. Miriam felt something shift in her chest, a tightness she couldn't name. She wasn't sure what she was looking at, but she knew it mattered. She knew it the way you know rain is coming before the sky changes, something in the pressure, something in the stillness. She kept reading. The ledger continued through the 1960s and into the early 1970s. The coded entries grew more frequent. And then, in 1974, the entries stopped. The last page had a single line, written not in Eloise's hand but in Colleen's, younger, rounder, less certain, closed by necessity. God keep them all. Miriam closed the ledger and pressed her hands flat against the cover. She sat like that for a long time, listening to the creak, feeling the weight of the house around her like a held breath. She wasn't ready to understand yet. But she was beginning to feel the shape of what had been hidden. The next discovery came from the basement. Miriam had avoided going down there. The door was in the kitchen, narrow and painted shut, and it took her 15 minutes with a flathead screwdriver to pry it open. The stairs were steep and wooden, creaking under her weight, and the air below was cool and mineral-scented, like the inside of a well. The basement was larger than she expected. It stretched beneath the full footprint of the house, with stone walls and a packed earth floor. There were shelves along one wall, stocked with canning jars, green beans, tomatoes, peach preserves, all old, all sealed. All arranged with the same meticulous care that characterized everything Colleen touched. There was a workbench. A lantern. A stack of folded blankets, moth-eaten but clean. And in the far corner, behind a shelf that swung outward on hidden hinges, there was a room. Miriam hesitated at the threshold. The room was small, maybe 10 by 10, with a low ceiling and walls that had been whitewashed at some point. There was a cot. A small table. A wash basin. A shelf with 3 books on it, a Bible, a dictionary, and a collection of poetry by Langston Hughes. On the wall, someone had pinned a photograph torn from a magazine, a picture of a sunset over a wheat field, the kind of image that could mean freedom or longing, depending on who was looking. Miriam sank onto the cot. The springs groaned beneath her. She picked up the poetry book and opened it. On the inside cover, in pencil, someone had written, "For E. Who opened the door when no one else would. R.M., 1963. She held the book in her lap and looked at the room, really looked at it. The whitewashed walls. The hidden entrance. The careful, quiet provision of necessities. A place designed not for comfort but for safety. A place designed to be invisible. And then she understood. Not all at once. Understanding came the way light comes in the mountains, slowly, by degrees, filling the hollows last. But she understood enough. Enough to know that the guest house had not simply been a guest house. That the coded entries in the ledger were not accounting errors. That the people who came here with no last names and stayed for weeks had been running from something, and that her grandmother, her quiet, stern, Bible-reading grandmother, had hidden them. The dates in the ledger, the late 1950s through the early 1970s. The geography, eastern Kentucky, the edge of Appalachia, a region where the mountains made borders and the roads were known only to those who lived on them. The context assembled itself slowly, piece by piece, like a quilt being laid out on a bed. Civil rights workers. Black families fleeing violence. People moving through the South in the years when movement itself was dangerous. Eloise Alder, a white woman in a white county, had turned her guest house into a way station. And Colleen, young Colleen, who never left, who never married, who stayed behind when Gerald went north, had helped her do it. Miriam sat in that hidden room beneath the guest house and wept. Not loudly. Not dramatically. She wept the way a field absorbs rain, slowly, deeply, without resistance. In the days that followed, Miriam pieced together more of the story, though she knew she would never have all of it. She found letters in a tin box under Colleen's bed, letters from people whose names matched the coded entries in the ledger. Some were brief and formal, thanking Mrs. Alder for her hospitality. Others were longer, more intimate, written years or even decades after the stays they referenced. One letter, dated 1987, was from a woman named Ruth Monroe, the R.M., who had inscribed the poetry book. She wrote from Detroit, "Dear Colleen, I think of the creek every day. I think of the sound it made at night, when I was too scared to sleep, and how it told me I was somewhere safe. I don't know if your mother is still living. If she is, please tell her that my daughter graduated from Howard University last spring. She's a teacher now. None of it would have happened without that room under the house. None of it would have happened without her. I named my daughter Eloise. I hope she doesn't mind." Miriam read this letter 4 times. She read it until the words blurred and she had to set it down and walk outside and stand under the dogwood tree with her hands pressed against the bark. Feeling the rough permanence of something that had been growing in this spot for longer than she had been alive. She began to understand other things too. Why her father had left. Why he never spoke about home. Gerald Alder had disagreed with what his mother was doing, not out of malice, Miriam suspected, but out of fear. The risk was enormous. In that time, in that place, hiding black travelers could have meant violence, arson, death. Gerald had wanted safety. He had wanted distance. He had gone north and built a life defined by its separation from Bowen Creek, and he had kept the secret not out of shame but out of a complicated, tangled love that couldn't bear to look directly at what it feared. And Colleen had stayed. Colleen, who never married, never traveled, never asked for anything. Colleen had stayed because someone had to. Because Eloise was aging and the work wasn't finished and the house needed a keeper. Colleen had inherited not just a property but a purpose, and she had carried it quietly for decades, even after the last guest left, even after the door to the hidden room closed for the final time. Miriam thought about that, about Colleen making 6 beds every week in a house no one visited. She understood now. It wasn't delusion or habit. It was readiness. It was a woman saying, with fresh linens and swept floors, "If anyone comes, we are here. The door is open." No one came. But Colleen never stopped preparing for them. Miriam stayed in Harlan County for 3 weeks. She had planned to stay 3 days. But the house held her the way the mountains held sound, gently, with nowhere for it to go. She did not sell the property. Instead, she called Boggs, the attorney, and asked about the process for registering a historic site. She called the local historical society and spoke with a woman named Darlene who listened to the story with the kind of silence that means someone is truly hearing you. She called the library in Harlan and asked if they had records of civil rights activity in the region. They had very little. That, in itself, was part of the story. She spent her evenings at the dining room table with the ledger open before her, cross-referencing the coded entries with the letters in the tin box. Building a picture of what had happened in this house. She counted 47 coded entries spanning 18 years. 47 people, at minimum, who had passed through the hidden room, slept on the cot, drunk water from the wash basin, and then moved on to wherever they were going next. Some she could identify from the letters. Others remained initials and dates, anonymous travelers whose stories had disappeared into the same mountains that had sheltered them. She thought about legacy. She thought about how her father had spent his whole life building something visible, a career, a house, a reputation, while his mother and sister had built something invisible. Something that lived only in the bodies and bloodlines of people who survived because a white woman in a forgotten hollow had decided that her guest house had room. She thought about her own life. The nursing. The patients she had held at 3 in the morning when no one else was awake. The hands she had washed, the forehead she had cooled, the names she had whispered into the ears of people who were dying and afraid. She had spent 26 years in rooms with strangers, making them comfortable, making them less alone. She had never connected this to anything. She had never seen it as inherited. Now she did. On her last morning before driving back to Dayton, to begin the process of packing up her apartment, giving notice, arranging the transfer of her life, Miriam walked down to the creek. It was early, just past dawn, and the mist lay in the hollow like something poured. The water moved slowly over the stones, clear and unhurried, the same water that had been moving over these same stones when Ruth Monroe lay awake in the hidden room listening to it. Telling herself she was safe. Miriam crouched at the edge and put her hands in the water. It was cold. It was real. It was continuous. She thought about Colleen, dying alone at 89 in a house full of made beds and unopened rooms, the keeper of a story no one had asked to hear. She thought about Eloise, her grandmother, who had looked at the world's cruelty and answered it not with speeches or marches but with a hidden room and clean sheets and a door that opened inward. She thought about her father, who had loved his family enough to leave and feared the truth enough to never speak it. She thought about the 47 names in the ledger. The daughter named Eloise. The poetry book with its quiet inscription. The sunset torn from a magazine and pinned to a whitewashed wall, someone's small, defiant act of beauty in a room built for survival. And she thought about the title she had been given, this strange and unexpected inheritance, not just a house, not just land, but a question. The question of what it means to keep a door open when the world wants it closed. The question of what it costs, and who pays, and whether the payment is ever finished. Miriam stood up from the creek and dried her hands on her jeans. The mist was beginning to lift. Through it, the guest house appeared slowly, its gray walls and sagging porch emerging from the white air like something surfacing from deep water, patient, solid, waiting. She walked back up the hill toward it. The dogwood tree brushed her shoulder as she stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under her feet, the same creak they had made for 70 years, under the feet of guests and ghosts and women who chose to stay. She opened the front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet. The beds were made. The ledger lay closed on the table, its leather cover warm to the touch, holding its 47 names like seeds pressed into earth. Miriam sat down at the table. She opened the ledger to the last page, to Colleen's final entry, closed by necessity. God keep them all, and she picked up a pencil from the cup by the window. Below her aunt's words, in her own hand, steady and clear, she wrote, reopened. October 2024. M. Alder. She set the pencil down. She looked at the words. And she understood, finally, what the house had been asking all along, not whether someone would come, but whether someone would stay. Whether someone would keep making the beds, keep sweeping the floors, keep believing that the open door was not foolishness but faith. Colleen had known. Eloise had known. And now Miriam knew too, that some truths don't need to be spoken to survive. They only need a room. A bed. A window facing east. And someone willing to keep the light on, not because anyone is coming, but because someone always might.